All right, thank you all for joining us today. We are very lucky and privileged that Dr. Amy Conley Wright is here visiting us at University of Georgia from the University of Sydney, where she is a professor and the director of the Research Center for Children and Families. And so we're really excited for Dr. Wright to talk to us today about child protection, out-of-home care, and adoption in Australia. And I'm looking forward to the talk and then some discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'm glad this is an intimate crowd because we can have some conversation. So feel free, you don't have to wait till the end. Like if you have comments throughout, feel free to stop and we can discuss. So yeah, my name is Amy. I'm a professor at the University of Sydney. I've been in Australia for 10 years. So I'm an Australian citizen as well as an American citizen. And I think that's given me some perspective on both Australia and this country. And I think that's what is really helpful when you hear about another country is it puts a mirror up to your own country to think, why do we do what we do? And how has that been shaped by our own histories? And so I think I'm preaching to the choir here with Jane here. So this is what I'll talk about. Child protection, out-of-home care, and adoption. The past as context, the present, and then where we're going in the future. Before we begin, I want to share a tradition that we have, and it's a very strong tradition in Australia. So any meeting that you attend, including a Zoom meeting, will begin with an acknowledgement of country. That is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, or the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. And this is based in a custom that when Aboriginal peoples, and Torres Strait Islanders in particular, but Aboriginal people on the continent of Australia, would come to the land of another group, they would camp out at the border and they would wait until they were welcomed into the country. So people who are from Australia, from a particular Aboriginal nation, can give a welcome, and anyone else can give an acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that I work and I live on the lands of the traditional owners of the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that they bore the brunt of colonization because they were the people who were there in Sydney Cove when the First Fleet arrived, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And this is the language we have on our email. You know, we do it all the time. But also to acknowledge traditional owners of the land that we're on here, which I understand is the Cherokee and the Cree people, and that the land was never ceded. And that's what we say also in Australia, that this is sovereign land that was never ceded.
Can I ask when you started that?
That's been going for at least the 10 years I've been there, I think longer. And it's traditional if you have a big meeting that you will have somebody from the local country to come. And often when they'll tell a story about when they'll do a welcome to country, they'll talk about the nation and its benchmarks. Like this, it's between this river and this mountain, and they'll sort of talk about the local culture. So it's a really beautiful thing to do. And it keeps us remembering the Aboriginal peoples and also the progress we need to make towards reconciliation, which is very important in Australia. We have a reconciliation day, and there are reconciliation action plans by organizations, and we need to move towards reconciliation after the brutal history that I'll share with you. So as I said, I'll just sort of talk about past, present, and future, and then talk in particular with Alice and anybody about comparisons with the US child welfare system. So some history and contemporary Australia. So I thought this would be a good way to start, okay? So on the 26th of January, we recognize a day in Australia that is called Australia Day. But it's also called Invasion Day, because it is the day that the First Fleet arrived, and I'll show you a painting of that. And you have these distinct camps of people. You know, so this is contemporary. This has happened in January. You have people who are out there with their flag, and you can see that our flag is essentially the British Union Jack. So it really shows and then it has the Southern Cross on it, the constellation of the Southern Cross. And you get a lot of stuff, you know, and then you also have Invasion Day where people are holding up the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander flag, or the Aboriginal flag, this one, that's meant to be the sun in the middle, and the red and the black, you know, about the Aboriginal, that recognizes the Aboriginal people. Torres Strait Islanders have their own flag. This was broadcast onto the Opera House to show images of Aboriginal peoples and two children. And it's really contentious now whether Australia should continue celebrating Australia Day. There was one of our two big grocery chains decided not to sell merchandise with Australia Day this year. A lot of people are taking another day. They're not taking off Australia Day. They're taking that as a day in lieu for another day. And that controversy is pretty recent. And It's also been the day that citizenship ceremonies have happened, and some local councils have moved those to different days. So people don't know how to handle this. We need to be recognizing our history, but should we be doing that with a barbecue, or should it be done differently? So I put some history up here from the US so you can compare, Australia in terms of its history of colonization. So the Jamestown colony in Virginia was the first American colony, or on what became American land, in 1607, but you can see the first Australian colony was 1788. And there's a relationship with our history in the United States because Great Britain used to send their convicts here to the United States. But then once the United States became a nation, no more were they accepting convicts. And so Captain Cook had already discovered the land. And so Captain Arthur Phillip, who became the first governor of New South Wales, brought the first fleet of prisoners to Sydney Cove. And speaking of a history of violence, there's a very interesting book called The Fatal Shore that talks about when the first fleet was in Sydney Cove and put the anchors down, some convicts took one of the boats, or maybe even convicts and guards, took some of the convict women, brought them over to the rocks and raped them. And that was the first European settlement. That was the marker of the New South Wales settlement. So there's been a history of violence from the very beginning. Violence on the convict women and violence on the Aboriginal women, which I'll talk about. And it lasted such a long time. So you think about 80 years of transportation going to the colonies of New South Wales, to Tasmania, which is called Van Diemen's Land, to Western Australia, and the last ones that ended in Western Australia in 1868. There were also free people who came as colonists, and that's why New South Wales stopped it earlier. But essentially, these were separate colonies until 1901. So they operated separately, and there were referendums to become a nation, and it became a nation in January 1901. So it's still a very new country, and the history of colonization is very fresh, and it's a big wound. And then this statement up here of terra nullius. So when you have Captain Arthur Phillip come here with the flag, planting the flag, they basically said, we claim this land because this land's empty, even though it wasn't empty. But there were no permanent structures because that's not the way that the Aboriginal people had lived on the land. So they claimed it saying it was empty land. And until the 1960s, and there was another referendum, the Aboriginal people were classified as part of the flora and fauna and not as people. So that gets into the Aboriginal Australians. So I'm going to play a short clip of my colleague at the University of Sydney because she talks about Aboriginal nations, clans, and family groups, and she speaks about this map, which we'll come back to. It's just a 3-minute clip. Yeah, there you go.
Kinship is a complex and sophisticated system of social organisations covering responsibilities, roles and reciprocal bonds, determining how people are related, who one can marry and who supports who. There are over 500 different Aboriginal nations across Australia, and they're connected through their kinship systems. Aboriginal nations cover wide geographical areas and have distinct borders consisting of rivers, mountains, rocks or hills. Within these nations, there are clan groups who have more specific borders, but these share common kinship and language. And within the clan groups, there are family groups. Kinship is based on either patrilineal or matrilineal lines of descent. So children from patrilineal nations will take their kinship structure, such as moiety, totems and skin names from their father, and be affiliated with other patrilineal nations. And the same is true for matrilineal nations, where children will take their line of descent from their mother. The kinship system also provides a framework to share knowledge with clans and families on a myriad of topics, like how to care for their environment. If you have a look at Tyndall's map, those colours represent the borders of the various nations, just like if you were travelling in Europe. So one of the key issues there is to understand that one Aboriginal nation cannot automatically move and live in another Aboriginal nation. Aboriginal people can't just be moved anywhere. Quite often, when a policy or strategy is being developed in working with Aboriginal people, communities or organisations, it's a one-size-fits-all approach. Look at all the policy documents that are written. What do they say? There is only one Aboriginal identity. They don't talk about Wiradjuri, Gamilaroi, Barkindji, Dunghutti, Eora. They talk about Aboriginal people. So there's just one whole identity. What you need to do is take that policy, that practice, that strategy and align it to the local nation, clan and family groups in that community. It's really important to understand whether a nation is matrilineal or
That's good. Yeah, I can explain the rest. So basically, I think the Aboriginal kinship system is the most incredible. I mean, if you think about caring for children, there's such a way that people are interwoven with each other and had responsibilities to each other, how they interrelated to other nations, based in that matrilineal and patrilineal lineage, that was just not understood and is still not understood, unfortunately, by social workers. And so social workers can make assumptions about why an auntie might show up instead of a mother, because the aunties and mothers are meant to have the same level of responsibility. Because all your aunties are your mother, all your uncles are your father. That kind of kinship structure is not one we still understand. When my colleague mentions about moving everybody together, people were taken off their countries and all these sort of countries and they were put onto missions. And so they were mixed together and the kinship bonds were broken. And so that happened through the stolen generation. I'll just preview this, the stolen generations, which were horrible and really these are scars that the country has not recovered from in any way, and people are still alive who were affected by these policies. So I'll come back to this, but a lot of it was, displacing a very old country, a very old culture that knew how to care for children and care for the country as well, by taking children away through a genocidal, approach called the stolen generations. So that's in our history. 60,000 years. And then white Australia. So the way that Australia tried to grow itself through immigration was to favor whites, particularly from the UK. And so you can see these are advertisements from the time, and it shows 10 pounds on there. So these were called 10-pound palms. They come over in the 60s, as late as the 60s, and just to kind of have a new life in Australia, and they were welcomed, but people were not really able to immigrate from other countries, particularly Asian countries, since we're in part of Asia. That changed after the 1960s, and Australia today is a multicultural nation, but it's a very recent thing, and so there's still like a kind of teething pains. They're still growing into this identity as a multicultural nation, and so many Australians are affected by immigration that you have first either immigrants or first-generation immigrants making up 40% of the country. And the population is growing quite a bit through immigration. But there are controversies. So you may have heard about this, that Australia doesn't allow people to come into Australia if they've tried to come by boat, so asylum seekers. And there have been some terrible stories coming out of Manus Island and Nauru of how prisoners are kept. And this was sort of like a mantra, stop the boats, don't let people come in this way. And a lot of people think that's very ironic with the history where people came in by boats. Everybody came in by boats, unless you're Aboriginal people. And the Aboriginal people, their dream time says they came from the land. They don't think they came from somewhere else. They don't think they came out of Africa. They came, dream time says they came from Australia. So they're the only ones who didn't come by boat. Everybody else got there by boat. So these are some of the challenges and controversies of present-day Australia, trying to deal with its history, its challenging history. And that comes out so much in child protection and out-of-home care. So there's some themes in the development of child protection and out-of-home care over time. So you have children who came, either the children of convicts or children of colonial settlers who were, if they couldn't be cared for by their parents for whatever reason, they could be placed in a generic asylum with adults. The first juvenile prison is in Australia. It was called Point Pure, P-U-E-R. Which was in Tasmania, in Van Diemen's Land, where they put boys So there were children kept in those kinds of situations, a very Dickensian kind of situation. But they were also put out as farm labor if they were boys or domestic labor if they were girls. So that was sort of the earlier colonial period. And industrial schools, also for children. Then I'll talk about the stolen generations, but there was this child rescue idea. So child rescue for poor, children who were from the colonial settlers, and the stolen generations, this idea of taking children away and putting them mostly into institutional care, but some foster care. Christian organizations have always been very involved, and so that comes out today in our history, and I'll mention that more in a minute. Large religiously based non-governmental organizations, particularly from the Anglican Church, Catholic Church, and uniting churches. And then sort of care and protection legislation from the 1950s. So we have a story that's in our news right now that kind of brings up some of this history. There was an Aboriginal baby who came into care, and it should be, according to our legislation, that her aunt should be considered. Any kinship placement, particularly from Aboriginal care, would be preferred. But because Anglicare Sydney did not want to certify this woman because she was in a same-sex relationship, this is a real scandal now. I think people didn't even realize that the church-based organizations could do this because they're circumventing our legislation. And so some of that history is very much still there. And as I'll talk about this painful history, a lot of the big organizations that were involved in things like forced adoption, which I'll talk about, they're still there. They're part of the present-day child welfare system. So it's, the history is still there, and it's a really difficult history. Some statistics on the child welfare system in Australia. So, have almost 500,000 notifications per year, and that has been rising. So there's a lot of pressure on frontline services, much like in the United States, where you get mandated reporting, get a lot of reports. And in New South Wales, a lot of those reports don't materialize in any kind of services, but there's a lot of reports to go through. The number of children in care has been increasing. Emotional abuse is the biggest category, and Alice and I have been talking about this because it's a little bit mystifying about what that means exactly, but one thing it means is exposure to domestic and family violence, or being a child victim of domestic and family violence. And domestic and family violence is a very big problem in Australia. It's incredible how bad it is. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are really massively overrepresented, and that will come through this whole discussion. So, in substantiations, they'd be 40 compared to 5.7 if you kind of look at their representation in the population, and out-of-home care, 57. So you can see, as I'll talk about more, they're more than 10 times as likely to be in care than non-Indigenous children. Another group of children that's more likely to be in care are children in remote and very remote areas. So Australia actually has one of the most urbanized populations in the world. Most of the population live in Sydney and Melbourne and the big cities, or sort of big regional areas. But you have some really remote areas that are in the outback, and children are more likely to be substantiated for child maltreatment out in the outback. It's harder to get services for them too. So the stolen generations, I'll play a song that just gives some of that history. Do you want to see if you can pull it up? So basically, the estimates is that there were 1 in 3 to 1 in 10 Indigenous children who were taken during the stolen generations. And this is a song that it's from a man who was part of the stolen generations.
This story's right,
give some of the images.
This story's true. I would not tell lies to you, like the promises they did not keep, and how they fenced us in like sheep. Said to us, come take our hand, set us up on mission land, taught us to read, to write and pray. Then they took the children away, took the children away, the children away. Snatched from their mother's breast, said this is for the best, took them away.
As one woman said graphically, I'm a rotten mother. I cannot cuddle my children.
This is very disturbing. He just talks about how bad the rape and other things were. So he was one of the commissioners. So this came from a national inquiry into the stolen generations, 1997. And so they heard a lot of stories of people who are from the stolen generations to hear what happened to them. So yeah, so Aboriginal peoples were taken, put onto mission lands, combined together, so they weren't just with people of their own country, and so that messed up this sort of kinship, networks that they're meant to have. My colleague Lynette, she does this training where she puts the string and she connects people the way they're meant to be connected with kinship, practices, and then she goes around and cuts it, because that's what they did, Because it was really complex. It'd be like, this group of people have this, relationship, and they have these responsibilities. Like, they take care of gray kangaroo, and they never eat gray kangaroo. They take care of it, and these are their responsibilities. This group over here takes care of red kangaroo, and they can eat gray kangaroo, but not red kangaroo. Just this complexity of the way they took care of each other and their lands all got very messed up by this system. And children were particularly children who were mixed, children, that they were particularly a target because it was meant to be an assimilationist kind of policy where you would breed the black out of children and then eventually they would be assimilated. And it's still very much felt, and there's still a lot of people who were affected by this because it went into the 1960s. So there's Aboriginal Australians, Torres Strait Islander Australians who were part of the stolen generations, and there have been some reparations, but there's nothing you can do to really fix these things. And so there's a healing foundation to try to really address these intergenerational traumas that have occurred. And so just,
another question?
Yeah.
So if you said that 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 10 were affected,
yeah.
and when you think about it from a historical traumatic lens, what proportion of Aboriginal people who are now living in Australia, what proportion are affected in that way?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So there are reports that talk about that from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. It's a very large proportion, and it depends on where you go, because some places, like I said, were 1 in 3. So they say, like in Western Australia, for example, half of all Aboriginal people were affected by this. Yeah. So it's really depends on where you go, but it's very significant. Yeah, and so that intergenerational trauma has come into the later generations because they haven't learned how to parent. Yeah.
Everything was
disrupted. They don't have these networks of people who are meant to look after each other. Yeah. That's right. That's what the quote that got cut off was that this man said, he spoke to a woman, she said she can't cuddle her children because she was never cuddled herself, and the closest she had was when she was being raped. That was all she had. So it's horrible, and how do you fix it? But this is the most, there are a lot of pain attached to this in Australia. And so people are disconnected. So they may not know that they're Aboriginal. They may have lost those connections. They don't know where their country is. They don't know the language groups that they belong to. So there are efforts to reconnect people, to their heritage. But there are groups that say, like, this is the Grandmothers Against Removal, that basically we're having another stolen generation today because we have almost half of the children in care are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, even though they make up 3.8% of the population. There's a lot of concern on what we can do about this. And that is a future direction where there's interest in making sure that Aboriginal children and families are looked after by Aboriginal organizations. We have the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Child Placement Principle. This came into effect in the 1980s. So this was meant to, keep children, Aboriginal children and Torres Strait Islander children connected to their families, so that there's a placement hierarchy that they should, if they have to come into care, they should be placed with their Indigenous kin first, non-Indigenous kin, and then an Indigenous carer. And now there is sort of some accountability and measurement of that, if that's happening, and that they should have opportunities to connect with their families if they are separated from them. But there's been less implementation of the prevention side, and I think that's where we're going in the future, is recognition that we have to do more to not separate children in the first place. And we do have policy targets that say we should reduce this number, this overrepresentation. Okay, so adoption is another space that has a lot of pain attached to it, including the pain of some stolen generations who were adopted by white couples, but also other children. So this is a lot of where I've done my work. My research center was first called the Institute of Open Adoption Studies, so I encountered a lot of people who had lived experience of adoption, very much opposed to adoption. This is closed adoption, where people didn't keep their information about their family members. And then legislation changed and opened up some of that so people could connect with each other. But there was a very high proportion of adoptions, and there was a lot of pressure on women to give up their children, and that has been called forced adoption. So forced adoption was where women were under such pressure, there was so much sort of shame and stigma attached to it, and in some cases they actually were physically drugged and physically restrained, and their babies were taken from them. So this has been recognized also by the Australian government with apologies to for forced adoption, as there have been apologies for the stolen generation, and also memorials that are being put up. And in most states and territories, there's a memorial. I'm involved as an interim chair for a memorial to be put up in Sydney, and so there's a lot of people who were adopted, mothers who were affected by this, who want there to be a very public place people can go to a memorial so that history can be remembered, and that pressure, people can recognize that pressure on women, how wrong that was. Another group of, well, this is sort of subsumes the other group. So forgotten Australians are described as Australians who were in institutional care or out-of-home care, mostly the 20th century, and that includes child migrants. So some children were sent to Australia, to Canada, and probably other countries by themselves, sort of scooped up and sent to another country. And often, all of these children were at risk of sexual abuse, of exploitation for their labor, and so there have been apologies again to the forgotten Australians. There's been support for them to try to reconnect to their roots in some way, but just a huge number of Australians have been affected by this history of institutional care, mostly harm in those kinds of institutions, separation from family. So actually permanency is very controversial. Like, it's a concept that when I first started my work in New South Wales, most children simply aged out of care, and they weren't adopted and they weren't in guardianship. There's been more sort of a movement towards more guardianship recently, but there's a lot of kind of apprehension about not having eyes on children, and concern about the past history of adoption. So, most children, the children who exit mostly would go to their parents. Some would go on third-party orders. Some would be adopted by carers. But most children actually kind of just remain in long-term care. That's more the norm. If children are placed in a guardianship or adoptive arrangement, there's an expectation that the adopting parents or the guardians will continue to maintain contact with their family members, and that's very much a legacy of this history, where people have said how harmful it was to be cut off from family members. So adoptive parents are expected to have regular contact, usually face-to-face contact, same with guardians, with family members, particularly parents and also siblings, other people. And adoptions have declined enormously. So they peaked in the 1970s, and they've dropped 98% since then. And there were like 200 last year in the whole country. Many of them were adult adoptions, actually, and adoptions by step-parents. So it's really not utilized very much, and where adoptions do happen is in the state of New South Wales, where I am, where there's been a policy push for adoptions. But in other states and territories, they don't do it so much. So this history has a very long shadow and concerns raised. So future directions. So where are we heading in Australia? What are some trends that we can see? So we have something called the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children. It's the new kind of national strategy for the next 10 years. I've been involved in this as part of the National Coalition on Child Safety and Wellbeing. There's a group made up of Commonwealth, state, and territory governments, and there's an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership group that's very strong. And there's a lot of good things that this plan wants to achieve, but the challenge is that, unlike the United States, all of the funding for child protection and out-of-home care comes from the state or territory itself. So the country, the national level, the Commonwealth, doesn't have a lot of leverage over states and territories. They don't have a lot of accountability built in. It's not like with Title IV, where they control those funds, they can have measures of accountability. You can do that, but there's no way of kind of withholding funds or anything. So it's been a challenge, and the previous 10-year plan had really big ambitions to move towards a more prevention-based model, and it didn't work. So we can hope that this will work. But right now, the focus has really been on more of a national approach to early intervention and targeted support, addressing the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, better opportunities for data sharing and research, and strengthening the workforce capabilities. And there's another program that's called Closing the Gap, and that's about closing the gap in between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and non-Indigenous Australians, a range of issues, health, income, and child protection is one of them. So there is a target there. So a lot of attention is going in that direction, and the intention is to have more community-controlled organizations taking over. So I'll say more about that. Oops. Yeah. So we don't have something like the Indian Child Welfare Act, unfortunately, that really invests legal responsibility in Aboriginal nations. There were no treaties established in Australia that kind of recognized the legal sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And so we have those principles which are put into our legislation, but there isn't kind of a separate and parallel system. But there's a building up of the Aboriginal community-controlled sector, and there's an intention for the money that is attached to Aboriginal children going into care to go to Aboriginal community-controlled organizations. So there's a building up of that part of our sector, building up of the workforce, and that will have impacts on non-Indigenous, non-governmental organizations and many church-based ones, because they're going to have less money as more money goes to those organizations. So some of those organizations have incubated organizations and then supported them to be independent organizations. But we'll see more of that. There's sort of work underway to sort of see how is the larger NGO system going to be affected, and what can we do to really build up Aboriginal community-controlled organization, and how can we have more accountability built in so that the protections that we have for children really get implemented. There's growing awareness of the need for prevention and early intervention. We just had our first national incidence study in Australia about child maltreatment, and it's been done with adults as well as children, and it's really shocked everybody, and there's been a lot of media about it and a lot of presentations. Really surprising how many children in this instance, and adults as well, have experienced sexual abuse, have experienced physical abuse, emotional abuse. Exposure to domestic and family violence is really notable. You can see for children and young people, almost half have had that exposure. And the study also did a survey and sort of linked it to different kinds of youth risk behaviors, mental health. So this is driving more of a conversation about how can we have more early intervention and prevention. And there is more of a universal set of systems there, because Medicare is available to everyone through the health system. You can get some mental health. Everyone can access sort of, I think it's 10 or 6 and then 10 appointments with a therapist per year, but through a subsidy. So there's more access through a universal system than the US has. Safeguarding children is another area where there's a lot of attention at the moment. So we have these things that are called royal commissions, and there have been royal commissions on many different past issues and concerns. And there was one on institutional child sexual abuse, so children being sexually abused, in church-related organizations, in schools, in scouts and things like that. And that group of commissioners put out a set of propositions about what organizations should do to be proactive and prevent harm to children and be safe. And so organizations are now being held to these kinds of principles. There's growing attention to child sexual exploitation online, including we have an e-safety commissioner. And unfortunately, Australians are a kind of a market for online child exploitation, particularly the Philippines. And so there have been some scandals of Australian men paying for those kinds of materials to be produced. And so one of the big banks got pulled into that because they were being used to funnel money to people who were creating child abuse exploitation materials in the Philippines. So they've funded some initiatives, including an initiative that I'm evaluating right now, which is about businesses and the role of businesses in trying to prevent child harm. And it's made up of large malls, hotels, and social media companies, thinking about how could they be proactive in their business practices to prevent harm to children. There's just been efforts to extend the age of care. So the age of care has now been extended to 21 in all the states and territories in Australia, but not, in some cases, not to children in residential care. So it mostly has focused on foster care and kinship care. So this is a pretty recent. It was only from 2023 that was universally passed. And so now there'll be a lot more attention to the implementation and what that looks like in the coming years. because children were just cut off at 18, kind of tossed out, and we saw what that happens, and the outcomes are. So now hopefully there'll be more support for young people as they, 21 is actually the age when people finish university, because it's 3 years university typically, so that's a positive move. And then we have a critical shortage of foster carers, which there's a cost of living crisis in Australia right now. Sydney is now the second most expensive place in the world for housing. And so a lot of people don't have an extra room, to have children in foster care. People have to have 2 incomes. And so it's really difficult to find enough children. And so one thing that's happening in New South Wales, because there's not a lot of residential care, it was preferred not to have residential care. So we have these alternative care arrangements, which are children, young people being put in a motel room with 24-hour care on a roster. And there's like a commission into that right now. So you can imagine. So the Office of the Children's Advocate is looking into that and asking young people who've been in that kind of care to come forward and talk about their experiences. So because there's such a shortage of foster carers, that's driving the conversations about prevention. Can we take fewer children away? And then also, can we professionalize foster care where that's actually a job? And so professional individualized care is the model that's being trialed in New South Wales and actually comes from Germany. So it's people who are like social workers, essentially, or therapists. They get paid for their job to be looking after the child, the young person they have in their care full time. So, yeah. So that's it. That's what's happening. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So I just want to say thank you, because I learned a lot. I don't know,
Okay.
I imagine others have a similar thing. I learned a lot that I didn't know about the Australian context, and so I'm just really grateful. I think what has struck me so much is how the US and Australia have similar starting points. We are both colonized lands, colonized with indigenous people, and that how we have progressed through the choices that we have made, the responses we have made. I don't think either is perfect. Most of them are both are rife with a lot of issues, but we made different choices throughout the way, and we still come to having some similar issues. The hoteling and the lack of foster care, that is a problem that we have here in the US. It's a huge problem. But I'm really struck by the difference in the views on adoption. I think adoption in the US is very much incentivized and prioritized as a form of permanency or exit out of our child welfare system, in contrast to in Australia, where it's just very much not viewed.
Yeah.
So
Can I say I was really blindsided because I took this job as the director of the Institute of Open Adoption Studies, and I was not prepared for the kind of emotional onslaught that would come with that. So I met with people who have lived experience of adoption, including I had this meeting with this man who had been adopted and this mother who was forced to give up her child. And I always remember because she said, she was forced to give up her child. Then when she could have contact, he put in a contact veto. He didn't want anything to do with her. She never had another child. She never got married. And on her child's 40th birthday, she had an aneurysm. It was just completely destroyed her life. And she was still so vocal for this group of mothers that really became her life, was really giving recognition to the experiences she had. There's so much harm that is not really passed, in these kinds of things, in terms of people who are still alive or people who their families have been very affected by these histories.
Well, do others have any questions that you have? I have found this to be,
Good.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Yeah.
And I think one thing that we really are struggling with is this, the past isn't past, right? Because the further generations are impacted by what went before, and so you can't. There's no easy starting place, right? When you're talking about any kind of repair, it's like, well, what needs to happen? What has to happen right now, and then how do we widen that circle? what needed to have happened and what do we do about what didn't happen, and then what needed to have happened and what do we do about what didn't happen. But it's such a huge, it is an existential problem for Australia, I imagine, as well as the United States. It's very challenging to talk about these things because it disrupts our whole understanding of who we are, and then if we want to assert that this is harm that's been done by governments that requires repair, that's expensive, and what do we do about that? So as you come here and look at us, what are you surprised by, or what is sparking ideas in you that you are seeing here?
Well, one thing I'll comment on that is not happening in Australia and that's happening here is the opioid addiction crisis. And also, because the opioid addiction crisis is massive here, and this is driving a lot of kids into the foster care system. We do have a problem with methamphetamine addiction. I think they call that ICE in Australia, but not with the opioids. And I think that's because we're all on Medicare, and they can track what prescriptions people have, and there's no way to game that system. It's not happening. Like, it's amazing to see how stark and how problematic it is here, and including, I'm blanking on the name, but there's that drug that is killing people. What is that called? Fentanyl. We don't have a fentanyl problem. We don't have an opioid addiction problem.
You don't even know what it is.
Yeah. It's not in the news and stuff. Like, it's not happening so much. Maybe some people are having some little bit, but it's not like the kind of, drastic crisis.
You didn't have like the oxycodone
no,
and all of that.
Didn't happen,
But even your observation opens a new conversation here, which is the idea that there is a government responsibility in the United States for the opioid addiction, because your argument would be, had we had a more universal approach to healthcare, that none of this damage would have been done.
And it's only been since the 1960s, I'll say, because I think people seem to think like, oh, you must have always had healthcare the same. No, actually, it was like in the 1960s, maybe even as late as in the early 70s, that it came in. So it's not even that old,
So I don't think, I think when in our current debates around healthcare, I certainly haven't heard anyone speak about that's a really interesting kind of argument and way of framing the impact of not having.
Well, it also strikes national health that it's only in the last 60 years, right? So it's not a forever thing. So often we think, the system is so big, it's going to be so impossible to untangle it. Well, no, actually, you just do it.
Yeah.
Figure it out.
Yeah, there was a particular very visionary kind of prime minister who, Gough Whitlam, who just put that in. He made universities free. That went away. It's not free anymore. But we have the universal healthcare system. I mean, there are fees that people have to pay for things, but it's, everyone has that, and it's not attached to your job. It's far better.
I want to thank you again
Yeah.
for coming out and speaking.
Pleasure.
With us.
Yeah.
I'm Janetta Washington.
Nice to meet you.
I'm part of the Type 4 program. And not as a student,
Faculty.
specific, but I was interested because there are a lot of similarities. And in terms of the structure, like the alternative care, housing wise, how is that structured in terms of caregivers, professionals? Like, how is that monitored, the safety wise? It's one of the things that we see with our wholesaling practices here is some of the harm that can be done to being part of foster care. And just kind of what have you guys seen in that practice? Maybe the good, the bad, the ugly.
It's going to be coming out pretty soon because there is this investigation happening, and they closed in November or something for statements from children. So we'll get a report at some point this year. But what happens is usually when a child comes in to placement, they're kind of placed on some kind of a system, and then non-governmental organizations can almost bid for that child and say, we've got a bed, we'll take that child, And that's why they're saying now it should be not just these Christian-based organizations, it should be these Aboriginal community-controlled organizations. They should have more of a chance to get those kids. But this is when there's a need for an emergency placement. And it can be when a child comes into the system, or it could be because they're being removed from a carer and they don't have another placement for that child. And it's meant to be a short-term, temporary emergency kind of placement. But there wasn't really an investment in residential care in New South Wales. You see a difference in that within the country. Some states like Queensland use more residential care, but we have very little in New South Wales. And now with the cost of housing, it would be very expensive to try to set up a residential care facility. So now it's like, uh-oh, now what do we do with these kids? Like, probably would have been better to have residential care than these motels, and it's a real mess. And so are kids being protected in those circumstances? We're going to find out, but probably not. So this history is a lot of like, we'll try this thing, uh-oh. Learn from the damage we've done, yeah.
Because what we see here is a lot of what we call contract providers providing them oversight.
Yeah.
And these are maybe agencies that are contracted with our county systems who provide that oversight. Is not necessarily a government worker who's trying to enforce certain policies. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot that can happen in that type of structure, right? Yeah. And so I was just kind of wondering. It's
similar, yeah. So there's NGO, non-governmental organizations that are delivering all these services, and they're supervised. They have a contract with the state government. We don't have counties, so it's all with the state government. But there can certainly be a lot of problems. But there's another story that's in the news right now of these Aboriginal children who were brought to England by their carers during the COVID thing, because Australia shut down for 2 years. A lot of Australia's history has to do with being so remote and being an island. So we just said like 2 years, no, nobody can come in, nobody can come out. So these people who were going to go on a trip to England to visit family, they got stuck in England. Something happened, and those children went into the foster care system. And I was talking to a colleague of mine in Northern Ireland last week, and she was saying, that's a scandal here, and it's a scandal for us in Australia that there are Aboriginal children caught up in the foster care system in England. Like, they need to come back. Yeah, and so there's pressure being put on the New South Wales Premier to get them back, because things happen. Like, why did that happen? Because you want to let the children be like part of the foster care, part of the family. They're going to go on a visit. They're going to visit grandparents or something like that. But then they'll get stuck over there. So, yeah.
Max, I wonder if there's anything that you observed.
Just for gender, I am just gender questions. So, as compared to researchers, so how do you evaluate like over child welfare system of Australia compared to American system? The strengths and weaknesses of Australian child welfare system compared to American system.
Yeah.
So researchers categorize Australia also categorized as a like liberal welfare state, but I think they still have kind of like universal English, past English system as well. I just want
So compare how the two systems function? Yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of similarities. There's a lot of pressure on both systems. It's a very crisis-oriented type of system. There's interest in kind of moving to more of an early intervention model, but I'm doing an evaluation of an early intervention program, and the big problem facing people is housing. So like, what do you do for families who need housing? Like, and that's the crisis that they're facing. You can't, like, getting them free housing is not really possible. So child protection is always having to deal with like problems that it doesn't really have levers of control over. It's like all the crisis that's hitting families, domestic family violence, cost of living pressures on families. And they end up being like, well, now we've got this kid, do what we're going to do with this kid.
It'd be very interesting, though. You could compare on a simple difference of like the substance use. Like you have certain substance use, but we have very different substance use issues here. You could compare to the burden, like look at the comparative burden of substance use between those two systems, and sort of it would. I mean, when you do have those natural differences, that might be a nice way.
Another natural difference is just that which responsibilities in terms of responding to poverty, how are our different, because clearly both systems in both countries, as you say, are being asked to respond to poverty, actually.
Yeah.
But social workers in these two different systems have different tools and at their disposal. So that's kind of interesting.
And cash welfare is available to people to a great extent, including middle class people actually tend to get some kind of money back from the government. That's the difference.
So these are like this would be interesting to write about.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'm mindful of the time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's great. This was a good conversation. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, pleasure. Okay, thank you.